What's up everyone and welcome to another Warframe video. Today we're going to be taking a look at a build for the latest non-prime Warframe, Gyre. She was introduced back in April with the Angels of the Zariman update and wasn't received too well. So here we are a few months on. How is she now and can we pull a decent Steel Path build out of her? Let's start by how to acquire her. You get her parts from the various tiers of the Zariman bounties. It shouldn't take overly long to get her, provided your RNG hasn't decided you're going to have an awful day. It's longer than other bounty frames though, to be fair, due to the fact that you only get one reward per bounty rather than the multiple you get from other bounty sources, so time to acquire is going to vary fairly wildly. Before we head into build, let's do a very quick TLDR of her abilities. Her one throws out a ball, puts up an AoE effect, applies electric procs and electric damage to anyone inside, which will double if you hit more than 3 enemies or 3 or more enemies on the throw. And her third ability is going to cause any damage done by this ability to crit. The 2 will throw out a ball, can bounce around and will suck enemies into it when it expires or if you recast it. And it will do electric damage and apply electric procs, as well as ragdolling enemies caught in its AoE. Her third ability, once again, is going to cause any damage caused by this ability to crit. Her 3, which we've already mentioned a couple of times already, generates energy for you, which can be increased with strength. It boosts your modded critical chance by 50%, which can be increased with strength. And it gives your abilities the ability to crit, with that able to get up to an incredibly tasty 300% with enough strength. Now her 4 casts an AoE around you, giving you a movement boost but also granting you the ability to shock any enemy that comes into contact with the sort of spinny blocky things that surround her. And while this ability is active, any critical hit from a weapon you're using will cause chain lightning that will hit multiple targets around the target that is hit with the crit. And her third ability, once again, will cause all damage done by her 4 to crit. Now her passive, unlike some frames, is actually incredibly relevant here, where her abilities will gain 10% chance to apply critical damage for each stack of the electric proc that is applied to an enemy. So either modded for on your weapons or purely relying on her abilities to build those stacks, you can make your abilities do a pretty respectable amount of damage, making this an incredibly worthwhile passive. So let's take a look at her builds. We have 2. One for more average play, and one for the absolute chads that can make rolling guard frames work, which, well, admittedly, I am not one of them. So let's take a look at the first build. We're focusing massively on power strength for a number of reasons, using Umbral Intensify, Blind Rage, Growing Power, Transient Fortitude, and Augur Secrets. One of the reasons is we're helmeting on Pillage here to help with survivability. With these mods and also the Arcane mod augmented, we can actually hit a 100% armor and shield strip when we cast Pillage, which in Steel Path is an absolute godsend, especially since it works on the new Exami, which is absolutely glorious. Then we're using Streamline, Prime Flow and Energize combined with her 3 for energy generation. Blind Rage makes recasting 2 abilities fairly constantly incredibly costly, especially since her 4 costs 125 energy every 15 seconds, which is pretty huge. Then we have Redirection to give more shields for Pillage to work with, Adaptation to give damage reduction on those shields, and Prime Sure-Footed to make sure we never ever get knocked down, because on this type of frame, knockdown is just straight up death. As for playstyle, cast Pillage as often as your energy will allow, have your 4 up all the time and use a weapon with high crit. There's not a lot to really micromanage on this one, to be perfectly honest, and it's not a bad build. You can get to an hour and Steel Path reasonably easily, you don't have to worry about dying every 2 seconds, although probably the last 10-15 minutes is going to be fairly hectic, because the incoming damage is going to take you down very quickly, so you're going to have to be very quick on that Pillage. I do die, because I sort of phase out every now and again. I do die a couple of times, even in the footage, and it is that type of frame. If you phase out, you are going to die. However, slap on Madurai, and pop your operator every sort of 40 seconds or so for super fast casting to really boost that pillage and the 4, since the cast speeds, especially on the 4, and if you manage to get your 3 disabled somehow, they are very, very long. So going with that Madurai for the extra cast speed is incredible. But this is a really fun build to play around with, especially since electric arcs everywhere is pretty glorious. So the second build, this is the one out here for the chads who can make rolling guards work. The core of this build is actually fairly similar to the first one I talked about, 100% strip on pillage with those same strength mods. Survivability, we have rolling guard to go invincible for 3 seconds every 7 seconds, and adaptation to apply damage reduction to those shields from pillage. Efficiency is handled very differently here and might raise some eyebrows. Streamline and equilibrium to work with the 3 for energy generation. Now how are we proccing equilibrium, I can hear you asking? Well, we're using Panzer Cap with the viral quills combined with synth deconstruct. The spores applied to enemies counters damage, and as such they will proc synth deconstruct, which can drop a health orb proccing equilibrium. It's a pretty cool bit of tech, and one that I actually have another build more focused around coming fairly soon, TM. As for playstyle, I'll be the first to admit I'm not good enough with rolling guard frames to be able to get much out of this build at all. I do know though from a friend that this build absolutely does work and is all about balancing the timer from rolling guard, pillage and the operator, trying to make the most out of all of the invul windows to really make you essentially unkillable. I did try this build, I couldn't make it at all, make it work for me at all anyway. Mostly because I have a tendency, as I just mentioned, just to phase out and lose track of timers. I'm getting old, damn it, but master those timers, and this is an incredibly strong build. So what do I think of Gyre? Well, honestly, while I like the build we have for her here, it feels more like we're taking advantage of her buffs and buffing weapons, really, than we're actually utilising her actual abilities and her full kit. We're taking her 1 off the frame entirely, we're not using the 2 at all, and that's because the damage just doesn't really scale that well into Steel Path whatsoever. Not to mention that because they both interact with the environment, they can just disappear, they've got a mind of their own, and that makes them incredibly hard to play around with. Combine that with, honestly, incredibly lackluster base stats that it's kind of hard to do anything with, and she becomes more about those damage buffs than the actual frame itself. And there are a million frames with a damage buff, to be perfectly honest with you. The use of electric procs for crowd control is fun, is actually pretty effective, and that would be fine, but that recently took a hit with the introduction of the new Eximus units who completely ignore crowd control, and as such ignore these electric procs. And that means part of her survivability, those procs, now don't affect the highest priority targets, the ones you badly need to control. Does that mean that I think she has no use? I don't think she has no use, but I find it hard to justify picking her over something else. Looking at the footage throughout the video, I feel that she has a place, and honestly, once I found a build I was happy with, she was actually a ton of fun. But the problem is, it doesn't feel like playing her as she was intended to be played, but without some form of damage that scales into the proper endgame content, like the Steel Path. This ends up being her only real viable build. Not to mention that as you start to get higher levels in the Steel Path, as I mentioned earlier, her survivability does become pretty suspect, especially when facing a high damage output faction like the Corpers. A meaningful bump in her shield and energy, for example, would be something that might help a fair bit. So that's my thoughts on Gyre. Let me know what you think of her in the comments below. Have you found a build that you think works better than this, or an alternative that you think I should check out? I can always do a follow-up video depending on those builds. I absolutely hope you enjoyed the video though. I'll have more Warframe videos coming soon. I have a couple planned. I have one that has currently the working title of The Gloom Problem, so stay tuned for that. I hope you all have a fantastic day though, and I shall catch you in the next video.